يطالب بحقوقه، وهذا الأمر أصبح
نفسه
والله لبنان لديه الإرادة
يصل إلى تل أبيب. هو من ضاحية من تل أبيب للحظة سقوط جاءتنا قبل قليل من لكن هذه صور جاءتنا قبل قليل من تل أبيب للحظة سقوط
Still expecting that more people, hopefully not, but still more people could be with health in Gaza. The Minister of Health said earlier that the airstrikes.
All right, Safwat, for the moment, many thanks. Al Jazeera's Safwat Al-Khaloud there, live in Gaza. The United States is saying that it's deeply concerned by the escalation between Israel and those launching rockets. The statement says Israel has the right to defend itself and to respond to rocket attacks. The Palestinian people also have the right to safety and security, just as Israelis do. State Department spokesman Ned Price has said at his daily briefing, he said that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spoken to Israel's Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Marwan Bashara, once again our senior political analyst. What do you make of that statement, Marwan?
Just listening to you, Adrian, Biden statements, that's BS, right? Biden statements. But of course, anything that comes out of Washington is incredibly important when it comes to Israel, Palestine, regardless whether you abbreviate BS or anything else. Because in the end of the day, as we all know, no one is able to pressure Israel to use the kind of leverage that the United States has on Israel or with Israel in order to change Netanyahu's course in this escalating conflict. And that's why you would hope that as it departs from its predecessor's reckless policy, meaning a bit more objective, if you will, even in terms of caring for Israel's long-term security interests and survival in the region. Because once the dust settles on this mayhem that Israel is causing in Gaza and that Hamas is causing in Israel, we, I promise you, will be back into the same point zero, right where before this whole thing started. So I think that the sadism and the cynicism that is being used by Israel and America's silence and this whole idea of that there are both sides and all sides is, as we all know, rather fake, because there is one potent, advanced nuclear major military power that's called Israel, and then on the other side we have a 50-year-old concentration camp of refugees called the Gaza Strip. As we've heard from our correspondent, it is indeed one of the most, if not the most, impoverished strip of land in the world. Over 2 million people living in the most dire of circumstances after having been more or less besieged for many years now. So we've seen this sort of conflict happen, Adrian. We've seen it before a number of times. And we've seen that the only distinguished result is that the Gaza Strip is becoming more moderate, and the situation has become more grim. And hence, the root causes for further tensions moving forward, of course, increase. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative would have been very, very simple, which is for the Netanyahu government, or for any Israeli government for that matter, to calm the spirits in Jerusalem, to recognize that the Palestinian citizens of the city have equal rights like its Jewish citizens, and that Palestinians in general have rights in their own homelands, indigenous population, and that whether they live in Gaza, in Ramallah, the Galilee, or Jerusalem, that Palestinians deserve the kind of justice and the kind of equality that Jewish citizens deserve. And last but not least, and that's where, if you all remember, and to remind our viewers around the world, this thing did not start in Gaza, it started in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, despite all the complexities that I've heard in our network and other networks over the past several days, it is the Palestinian creed. The Israeli greed is because they're themselves. That they are more than willing to share the city with Israel. And here we are. The Israeli leaders want it all. The Palestinian leaders are happy to share. Want to have it all for themselves, or those who are more than happy, or not that happy, but still would want to share the city with the other party. surely, and this has been happening for years now, but it certainly increased under the Trump administration. And sadly, Adrian, the Biden administration did not reverse that policy. In fact, what we've heard from Secretary of State Tony Blinken is that the United States will continue to hold and to continue to have its embassy in Jerusalem, de facto recognizing the so-called eternal united Jerusalem as capital of Israel, which is, as we all know, is a total farce. Because despite the insistence that this is united and this is eternal capital of Israel, everyone knows in Palestine, even in Israel, in the Middle East, and throughout the international community that Jerusalem is not united, that East Jerusalem is an occupied city under international law, under international humanitarian law, and that the only way a united Jerusalem could become a capital is of a binational Israel-Palestinian state. With the Palestinians, but with the Arab and the Muslim world. And here we are talking about several 100 million Arabs and more than 1.5 billion Muslims. I'm not sure Israel really want to instigate that kind of a conflict over Jerusalem with that many people.
Political analyst Marwan Bashara there, live in Doha. For the moment, Marwan, the White House press secretary has been speaking within the last few hours. What she had to say about all of this?
Yeah, that's right. The White House press briefing delayed a couple of times, and now we know why. We know that they said is just moments before she came out to brief reporters that the situation that has been going on for many days. The press secretary saying that it is the position of Joe Biden that Israel has a right to defend itself, and the United States condemning the ongoing rocket attacks by Hamas and other groups. But at the same time is the belief of this administration, she says, that Jerusalem should be a place of coexistence. And she said that the United States is urging Israel to work towards restoring calm, that the diplomacy dialogue. Having said that, something that we did a little recent days from the press secretary is that the administration has been speaking candidly, she said, to Israel regarding the evictions of Palestinian families, that these evictions by Israel is working against the interests of achieving a solution to the conflict. So this a little bit more forceful in language and actions in terms of how the United States is nudging Israel than we've seen in the last couple of days. What the press secretary is also saying is that all parties must adhere to a two-state solution, that this is what this administration believes is the only way to achieve.
The tower building, Israel's Iron Dome missile system, simply unable to cope with the sheer number of projectiles heading towards Tel Aviv, and there have been injuries on the ground in Tel Aviv. There'll be much more on this with my colleague Mariam Namazi in London.
You're watching Al Jazeera, and breaking news this hour, a second day of Israeli airstrikes and Palestinian rocket attacks. These are the images that we've been seeing. There have been international calls for de-escalation, though Israel and Palestinian armed groups have been ramping up their attacks in the most intense exchange of fire. Has gathered pace, and this, of course, as night has fallen in Gaza. So just under 2 hours ago, an Israeli airstrike brought down a residential tower block in Gaza City. The Israeli army is saying that it informed the residents of the Hanadi Tower to evacuate before it was targeted. It says that Hamas has an office inside this building. And this is the view on the ground. No word yet on casualties across the Strip. Gaza's health ministry says at least 28 Palestinians have been killed in the past 24 hours. This includes children. Now, the Palestinian group Hamas have said that they fired 130 rockets towards Tel Aviv, Israel's second largest city and economic capital. This is the moment one of those rockets hit a bus in Holon, one of the city's southern suburbs. One woman was killed. Air raid sirens are ringing out now across Tel Aviv, with residents of the city taking cover. And then earlier on, 2 women were killed in the Israeli city of Ashkelon, just north of Gaza. The military wing of Hamas and Palestinian armed groups have been firing hundreds of rockets into southern Israel. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, vowed to step up attacks in Gaza.
We are in the midst of a campaign. Since yesterday, the IDF has been striking Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. We eliminated commanders. We hurt a lot of their quality targets. The conclusion of the meeting is to increase even more the force of the strikes and also the rate of the strikes. Hamas will now receive blows that it did not expect.
Well, Al Jazeera's Safwat Al-Khalut and Harry Fawcett are covering developments from Gaza and southern Israel. Obviously, we'll be speaking to them both. First, though, to Safwat.
Palestinian died in the hospital. He surrendered to wounds he sustained earlier, so which increased this total up to 29 Palestinians, 2 of them, or including 2 women and 9 children. More than 150 Palestinians injured so far from 2 days of Israeli airstrikes all over the Gaza Strip. After the destruction of Hanadi, 4 residential buildings to evacuate as the Israelis will destroy them, which means that tens of families have to leave their homes and lost their homes because of the Israeli airstrikes, and it took them years to find more houses or to rebuild the destroyed houses. From the destroyed building, we haven't heard about any casualties because people left before the destruction of the building. The building just right behind us here, the red one, if you could see it in the picture or on the cam. It's one of the buildings that were being. Also hear the rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel, hovering from our. Some of them are maybe fighters, as the Israelis claim. So far, there is a big tension in Gaza from the coming hours, because we understood now that a promoted level of bank of targets, which is destroying the residential buildings, and they could also military commander and political officials also of the Palestinian factions could be part of the Israeli bank of targets. In response, the Palestinian fighting groups, armed groups including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other smaller groups, as we hear just an explosion. It's very close to our office. They hit the building that I just mentioned minutes ago. Yeah, this is a warning rocket. We call it a warning rocket when the Israeli drone hit the building with a small rocket, which is the last or the final warning, which will be followed or expected to be followed by bigger Israeli rockets, which will bring it all down. We will have to move now. We expect that the destruction of this building could fly and reach even our office, because only a few meters separates between our office and this building.
Strike that we just heard is an alert to warn people to try and evacuate the building before a larger this target. This is another residential tower block that.
Yes, this building, by the way, as we know, there are lots of media groups renting offices in this building, including newspapers, TVs, and other media groups. So it's not totally residential, then it's for official, let's say, official use. So all what we know about this building, it's famous in Gaza that it's full of media groups, newspapers, radios, local radios, TVs, etc. And now this is the second warning rocket on the top of this building. So,
and Safwat,
the next attack is now expected to be war jets, rockets for the destruction of this building.
Right, and this is not far from the Al Jazeera office, which is obviously where you are located now.
It's 200 meters or less than far from our office.
And you were saying that in the Hanadi tower block there are reports of one casualty, though we're awaiting further information from the health ministry. They are likely to release figures shortly. But actually, Safwat, just want to make sure that you are safe and you're able to take cover and go wherever you can, do what you need to do.
We are trying our best to avoid any flying shrapnels or any destruction or stones from this building. All of my colleagues now are also aware that something could fly from this building and hit our buildings. We are trying our best to avoid any of these bad things, let's say. Hopefully it will end peacefully. Well, the destruction of a residential building is not peaceful, but I'm talking about me and my colleague. We are hiding. We are taking some corners, hiding in some corners. Hopefully it will end in a peaceful way.
Indeed. Well, I will let you go for now, and maybe we can speak on the phone or something later. But Safwat, for now, thank you very much. Let's go live to Harry Fawcett, who's in southern Israel, near Gaza. Harry, what have you been seeing or hearing? Has there been an acceleration in rocket attacks coming through?
Well, yes. I mean, the last few minutes have been a lull, but just before 9 o'clock local time, so about an hour and 20 minutes ago, was when this enormous barrage of rocket fire out of Gaza began. There had been warnings, as Safwat was saying, that there would be a response to the destruction of that first large tower inside Gaza. Now it seems that it is going to be the first. In a series, and that Tel Aviv would be targeted. That is exactly what took place. Hamas saying some 130 rockets were fired in a very short period, and the damage in and around Tel Aviv is pretty extensive, given how much of that was apparently intercepted in the city of Holon, south of Tel Aviv, another in Rishon LeZion. That was the initial report. We're also just seeing some military maneuvering around here, some military jeeps heading south toward the border. We've been seeing reinforcements arrive in the shape of armored vehicles and tanks earlier as well. And so this is an extremely large attack on Tel Aviv. And the Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, they're due to speak to the nation at 10:15 local time, so in about 3 or 4 minutes' time. The signs are that they're probably going to announce still further escalatory moves in this extremely dangerous and already deadly situation. On the Israeli side, we have 4 dead, according to reports so far throughout the course of the day. In this latest round, another 16 injured, one of them in a critical condition. And of course, as you were hearing from Gaza, from Safwat, a much higher number of both dead and injured there, 28 killed in Gaza so far. It seems that things are set to get worse.
So injuries and fatalities there in southern Israel, but you were saying that areas that are being targeted or that are deemed to be at risk, people in those areas are evacuating. Where are they moving themselves to?
Well, a lot of Israeli residents have safe rooms in their own houses. There is an understanding that into a lot of houses there is one room built that doubles as a bomb shelter, a bedroom or a storeroom or the like. As well as that, there are many shelters just scattered around neighborhoods. We're here at a junction next to a bus stop, and there is a large, very solid structure here, again, for that very purpose. So that is a contrast that my colleague Safwat's been drawing between the situation in Israel and Gaza, and it's a very correct one. There are relatively frequent and easily accessible opportunities to shelter. However, there aren't many instances where there is this kind of mass attack in terms of rockets falling on one concentrated spot during one very concentrated period. It's happened twice during the course of the day so far, once in Ashkelon, then after this initial threat by Israel to bring down a big residential tower, Hamas said that what happened in Ashkelon would be dwarfed or would be eclipsed by what would be taking place in Tel Aviv later. And that seems to be exactly what has happened. And we are expecting a response, not just militarily from Israel, but also politically from the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, any moment now.
Harry, is there a sense that people there, residents, and this conversation comes off the back of existing tensions through the Muslim month of Ramadan? We're just reaching the final few days of that month now, and in the holiday, the Muslim holiday of Eid. But also in the last few weeks or the last few days, we've seen some of the worst violence and tension in Jerusalem than there's been for years.
Yes, I mean, everybody was, and especially over the last 4 or 5 days, and skirmishes that we saw. Relocation of Jerusalem, what international and Palestinians view as the illegal occupation beginning in 1967. There were concerns that Monday could be the defining day that this all boiled over. And indeed, that is what we saw. We saw it happen in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound with those dreadful scenes of extremely large-scale Israeli, large numbers of Israeli security forces entering the compound using rubber bullets, stun grenades, tear gas, batons against Palestinians who had stones and other objects that were being thrown. That was seen as a major tipping point, especially by Hamas inside Gaza. The later attempts to try to de-escalate the situation did not do so, and Hamas issued its ultimatum that if by 6 p.m. on Monday Israel did not withdraw itself entirely from the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, if it did not withdraw itself from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which has been the site of a protracted battle over a potential eviction of Palestinian families from their homes in which they've been for generations, then Israel would pay a heavy price. And that price initially came in the form of a rocket launch, a long-range rocket launch, a very rare event on the area, on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And that is what began us down this latest path, bringing that tension to Gaza, to southern Israel, to Jerusalem, the outskirts, and now in a pretty much unprecedented way to Tel Aviv as well. This extremely large attack, which is the latest phase of what looks like a worsening, continuingly worsening situation.
Okay, thank you very much. From southern Israel for now, Harry Fawcett. And of course, as Harry said, we're expecting to hear from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to get an indication of Israel's planned response, obviously, in the coming hours and days. So we'll go to that as soon as it gets underway. But also in terms of other reaction, there's been the Arab League has condemned deadly Israeli airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, calling on the international community to take urgent action to stop the escalating violence. At an emergency meeting, Qatar's foreign minister called for an effective Arab position to stop attacks and violations, while Palestine's representative demanded urgent action to mobilize an international position to pressure Israel. Well, we're joined now by our just speaking to our correspondent in Gaza. From this, there are fears that the confrontation could get worse. How critical is it for there to be some sort of international intervention now?
Well, clearly there is no rush on the part of the Biden administration to do anything. In fact, although we've been tiptoeing, in fact, it is the Biden administration that has been the obstacle for a UN Security Council a statement, not to say resolution, on what has been going on in Jerusalem and Gaza. And without the United States will to do something, of course, nothing major will happen at the United Nations, and nothing major will happen in the international community because, of course, we're all busy recovering from Corona, and hardly anyone moves on the question of Israel-Palestine with optimistic, but it will depend to some degree how serious are the Arab countries in terms of pressuring Israel or pressuring the United States to pressure Israel. Because while they are not exactly in the best of shape, they do have leverage, whether it is diplomatic or strategic. If they do unite on an actionable plan to try to help out Jerusalem and Gaza, something could come of it. As I said, not in order to do something, escalating.
So, I think then that Israel's recent normalization of ties with certain Arab states gives them more leverage, potentially?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, in the end of the day, any diplomatic relations is a quid pro quo. And I think what is happening in Jerusalem, especially Jerusalem, not Gaza, what has happened in Jerusalem, and just by the way, that's why Netanyahu is eager to shift the eyeballs, if you will, from Jerusalem, where the popular peaceful resistance has happened, to Gaza, where there's retaliation and counter-retaliation. Unite the Palestinians of all walks of life, but it also unites the Arab people and the Muslim world, and in fact the international community on this question. So I think it was for the peaceful resistance in Jerusalem to have diplomatic relations with Israel, especially does Jerusalem card, if you will, or the humanitarian issue in Gaza, in order to say, look, we do have public opinion in Egypt, in Jordan, and other places, and we cannot maintain this sort of diplomatic relations and niceties with an Israeli regime that continues to push the Palestinians out of Jerusalem, continues to besiege Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, and continues to kill and create mayhem and destructions in Palestinian occupied territories.
But I suppose it is important to talk about Jerusalem, isn't it? Because that seems to be at the heart of very much the trigger of this latest round of violence that we're seeing and those planned evictions from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. It's so hard to describe how high the stakes are and how critical it is, so much at the core of Palestinian and Jewish national identities. It's not something that Israel would ever compromise on, even if it did mean an improvement in relations with its regional neighbors, I guess.
Well, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a question of choice, right? A forced unification of Jerusalem by force by Israel will not lead to peace, ever. You know, Israel will never, ever live in peace as long as it occupies the Palestinian people and occupies its capital, Jerusalem. This is the Palestinian proposal that they share the city and they share the land. So Israel has a very reasonable proposal by the Palestinians where there will be mutual recognition and a sharing of Jerusalem as a capital of both states. So there is a way out of the deadlock. There is a way out of the violence. There is a way out that is, in fact, recognized by the entire international community, including the United States. The United States, while it would not pressure Israel, it does recognize the need for a two-state solution, certainly the Biden administration does, and the need for East Jerusalem to be a capital of the Palestinian state. So that situation is clearly the best way out of the impasse, but it is not to the liking of the more radical. And just as a quick historic reminder, because we're all in this immediate event that is escalating in Gaza, we heard a call to prayers, but just a bit of a historical perspective, Mariam. It has Jabotinsky wrote his Tristesse, the Iron Wall, which Netanyahu follows today, that basically says, don't give the Palestinian any glimmer of hope that they will ever be able to maintain a Palestinian presence in Palestine or prevent the Jews, the Zionists, from establishing a total Jewish control in Palestine. Netanyahu is pursuing that kind of a reckless policy a century later. And we've all known that this has not helped peace, that this not help stability, and this is not making the Israelis any safer. So the way out is not taking the Palestinians for granted, is not, as Jabotinsky said, treating the Palestinians for fools, because as Jabotinsky recognized, and I'm talking about Netanyahu's guru, the Palestinians are no fools. They will never, ever give up their homelands for bribe or by intimidation. And so it is clear, I think, for many Israelis, for all Palestinians, for Arabs, Muslims, and for the international community, that the way out of this deadlock, it's not more bombardment, it is a diplomatic solution based on sharing the land. There is, but that proposition will not maintain Prime Minister Netanyahu in power. And that's why, once again, back to square one, it is Prime Minister Netanyahu, a serial liar, widely known as such, a great manipulator that is trying to use cynically the escalation in Jerusalem, the radicalization in the Israeli society, and the provocation coming out of Israel and Gaza in order to perhaps establish a national unity government, an emergency government like he did the last time around, in order to stay in power and not to go to jail. And again, as most of our viewers know, Prime Minister Netanyahu is on trial in Israel on major corruption charges that will end him up in jail like his predecessor, Ehud Olmert. But in order to avoid jail, he must maintain power. To maintain power, he is exploiting the tragedy, the death of innocents, the destruction in Gaza and elsewhere in order to stay in power. And that must stop.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right, so we're just hearing now from Hamas leader Al Hania.
To the resistance of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem called Gaza went forth, when the young people of Jerusalem called for help and called Hamas and called upon Mr. Mohammed al-Dayf and the resistance groups Gaza was true to its word and stood by its clear position and tribute to all the martyrs who were past defending Jerusalem on these days and these hours, paving the way for liberation and return to the blessed land of Palestine. Today, when we are witnessing this new chapter and in confrontation with the enemy, and we have achieved victory in the battle of Jerusalem and the defense of Jerusalem, when our people said no to the attack on the Aqsa Mosque, to push their extremists away from Al-Aqsa Mosque. So our people have fended off these false celebrations, which they called as the liberation of Jerusalem. These are the kind of celebrations they have been accustomed to for 5 decades. Our people have stood against them and forced those extremists, those aggressors and transgressors, the police and the force, forced them to stay away from the sanctity of the mosque. And our for the displacement of our people from Sheikh Jarrah area, and they have paid their lives and sacrificed. The son of Palestine, Mohammed al-Dayf, says any